What we're going to do over the next 5 weeks is work our way through Lamentations, a chapter a week. The blessing for everybody is on the 5th of September. We're going to have a commercial break as we have Creation Sunday, I think. So who would have thought that would have been some light relief in the future? So why Lamentations? Why have I thought, oh, that's a good idea. Let's spend a bit of summer looking at Lamentations, because that will cheer everybody up. I spent a bit of time over the last couple of months just wandering around to people. I said, you ever had a series on Lamentations before? No, I haven't had a series on Lamentations before. I said to Thelma, have you ever had a series on Lamentations before? She said, oh, no. Probably a good reason for that, though, but no, I never have. So what is Lamentations? And Lamentations is a book of poetry. And what it does is, Lamentations is reflecting on the destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians in 586 BC. Now, I know that we are all experts on the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC, so I'm not going to go into that in any great depth. But for those of you that are visiting, Ali's mum, I think perhaps of what we've seen in the news over the last few years, whether that's Syria or Yemen, or perhaps what we've been seeing this week in Afghanistan. We're talking about a city which has been completely and utterly destroyed. And the people have been taken away in exile. And what these poems do is they record a moment in time. So it's that moment in time. It's that time when the pig has landed on its snout. It's that moment in time where it's really desperate and tragic and sad and awful and frustrating and angry. And we're just in the mess of that situation. It doesn't have, although it hints at one, it doesn't have a happy ever after in the book. There's no happy ever after in what we will go through in the next few weeks. And it is a record of lament. And I would suggest gives us an insight into the importance of sharing our most raw of feelings with God. Now, for those of you that are into poetry or anything like that, it is written in acrostic form. Each chapter has 22 verses, and because I know you're all experts on the Hebrew alphabet as well, each verse starts with the A to Z equivalent in the Hebrew alphabet. Does that make sense? Okay, because you're all sitting there as Hebrew scholars saying, oh, I get that. So it's A, B, C, D, and so in the original Hebrew, that's how it's written. But it is a book of unrelieved pain and grief. And it's a book today where we all have those experiences which lead us to grieve, to mourn, and to lament. I quite like being a little bit left field in what I look at, what I read. And I read something a few years ago on Nahum. There's another book we'll do another time that I'm sure we all know lots about. Nahum. Yeah, I know exactly. It's an uncomfortable read. As we read, some parts will cut over the next few weeks, they come with a health warning. Some of them should come with quite a classification like you get on your films, your 15 or 18 certification. But this is the Bible that Jesus read. It's part of the work that the New Testament writers used as their living resource for understanding God. So what we're going to try and do over the next few weeks is explore that human voice of pain and unresolved grief. We're going to be summoned to remember and reflect on the many realities that people are facing, perhaps known to us, perhaps that we see creeping onto our news and the bits that don't creep onto the news. We'll flirt a little with the question of where is God when it hurts? And that very famous question, if there is a loving God, then why? So chapter 1. And I'll invite Chris and Jenny up to speak in a second. And chapter 1 has 2 speakers. We have the author, who's possibly Jeremiah. I don't really care, but it's possibly Jeremiah. But then also Jerusalem, the city personified. But Chris and Jenny, if I invite you up, please, to read chapter 1 for us.
Lamentations chapter 1. How deserted lies the city, once so full of people. How like a widow is she, who once was great among the nations. She who was queen among the provinces has now become a slave. Bitterly she weeps at night. Tears are on her cheeks. Among all her lovers there is no one to comfort her. All her friends have betrayed her. They have become her enemies. After affliction and harsh labor, Judah has gone into exile. She dwells among the nations. She finds no resting place. All who pursue her have overtaken her in the midst of her distress. The roads to Zion mourn, for no one comes to her appointed feasts. All her gateways are desolate, her priests groan, her young women grieve, and she is in bitter anguish. Her foes have become her masters, her enemies are at ease. The Lord has brought her grief because of her many sins. Her children have gone into exile, captured before the foe. All the splendor has departed from daughter Zion. Her princes are like deer that find no pasture. In weakness they have fled before the pursuer. In the days of her affliction and wandering, Jerusalem remembers all her treasures that were in the days of old. When her people fell into enemy hands, there was no one to help her. Her enemies looked at her and laughed at her destruction. Jerusalem has sinned greatly, and so has become unclean. All who honored her despise her, for they have seen her nakedness. She herself groans and turns away. Her filthiness clung to her skirts. She did not consider her future. Her fall was astounding. There was none to comfort her. Look, Lord, on my affliction, for the enemy has triumphed. The enemy laid hands on all her treasures. She saw pagan nations enter her sanctuary, those you had forbidden to enter your assembly. All her people groan as they search for bread. They barter their treasures for food to keep themselves alive. Look, Lord, and consider, for I am despised. Zion stretches out her hands, but there is no one to comfort her. The Lord has decreed for Jacob that his neighbors become her foes. Jerusalem has become an unclean thing among them.
Is it nothing to you, all you who pass by? Look around and see. Is any suffering like my suffering that was afflicted on me, that the Lord brought on me the day of his fierce anger? From on high he sent fire, sent it down into my bones. He spread a net for my feet and turned me back. He made me desolate, faint all the day long. My sins have been bound onto a yoke. By his hands they were woven together. They have been hung on my neck, and the Lord has sapped my strength. He's given me into the hands of those I cannot withstand. The Lord has rejected all the warriors in my midst. He has summoned an army against me to crush my young men. In his winepress the Lord has trampled virgin daughter Judah. That is why I weep, and my eyes overflow with tears. No one is near to comfort me, no one to restore my spirit. My children are destitute because the enemy has prevailed. The Lord is righteous, yet I rebelled against his command. Listen, all you peoples. Look at my suffering. My young men and young women have gone into exile. I called to my allies, but they betrayed me. My priests and my elders perished in the city while they searched for food to keep themselves alive. See, Lord, how distressed I am. I'm in torment within, and in my heart I'm disturbed, for I have been most rebellious. Outside the sword bereaves, inside there is only death. People have heard my groaning, but there's no one to comfort me. All my enemies have heard of my distress. They rejoice in what they have done. May you bring the day you have announced so that they may become like me. Let all their wickedness come before you. Deal with them as you have dealt with me because of all my sins. My groans are many and my heart is faint.
Bet you wish you did Moses now, didn't you? I wonder how you react to a tragic event when something affects you so deeply. We've seen events unfold in Plymouth over the last couple of days. And again, we may echo gratitude for the members of the emergency services who rushed towards when perhaps people would rush away. How do we respond? How do we respond when God is silent, although not absent? There is lament in the Bible throughout the Bible. Psalm 61 is one such example. Hear my cry, O God, listen to my prayer. It goes on, my heart grows faint, but you are my refuge. Help me, and I will sing your praise forever. And when we look at lament, we're looking at a sort of a normal-ish pattern. We have a complaint which is addressed to God. We tend to compare what's going on with what's gone on before. We cry out for relief, and then we state our trust in God to deliver us from that relief. Lament is a part of the Bible almost from day one. And Jesus lamented. If you want another passage that is rarely preached on, have a look at Matthew 23, where he's talking about the hypocrisy of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law in terms of how they taught, that they weren't looking at matters of justice rather than looking at things for themselves, focusing on the outward appearance rather than the inside. Then we get to this verse. Deep lament, as Jesus says, as he's looking over the city, and I've looked over the city of Jerusalem, it's fantastic. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you, how often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings. Deep grief, deep lament. But lament doesn't come easy. For one, it's not overly British. We perhaps have different preferred responses when we are facing these tragic occasions. We might moan or complain about something. Imagine Jesus, if he went down the moaning and complaining line. Oh, Jerusalem, you're so irritating. Can't you just get your things together? Perhaps we go into the blame game. It's somebody else's fault, or someone else has done this to me. Perhaps we try and be over positive. It'll be all right in the end, Jerusalem. Go on, keep going. You'll get there in the end. And whilst in those situations of real grief and struggle, it's tempting to try and change narrative, to proclaim that God works together for the good of all who love him, and that's absolutely right. What about this moment of here and now? What about that moment when the pig is on its snout. What about that? This is a 50p piece. It's usually in my pocket, might be in my coin tray. Sometimes I take it out when I'm refereeing, start the game. Very rarely. It's on its side, balanced perfectly. And of course, it won't be now. But that time, when the 50p is just resting on its side, that rare occasion in life when something happens, something just knocks you for six, and you're in that moment of grief or of pain and of suffering. And it's at that moment that we somehow, somewhere believe that God will bring all things together at the end of time and make all things new. But perhaps even that, at that moment, is of no comfort to the individual in the valley of the shadow of death. And for those times where the 50p is balancing on its side in a moment of tragedy, how are they to cope in that period of grief? And how do we respond? Perhaps we either respond to the person or people in that time, or how do we respond ourselves in those times when God is silent but not absent? In the passage that Chris and Jenny read, and if you can bear it, have a read later on as well. The author paints a picture of how everything was against Jerusalem. You could look at the use of the word all. All of her friends had betrayed her. All of her gateways were desolate, verse 4. All of the splendor had departed, verse 6. All who honored her despised her, verse 8. All people groan as they search for bread, verse 11. The author is painting a picture of the whole world being against Jerusalem. Grief evolves. We adapt, and grief, of course, amends us in some way. And there are people who can express that better than I, and we respond to it. But Lamentations is focused on that moment. It's focused on that moment of time where somebody can't see the wood for the trees. It's focused on that moment where you can't see your way out. And it's focused on that time where the grief is so raw and it's so central to who you are, you just can't see around you. It follows that pattern of lament, which I referred to briefly earlier. It addresses God, and it compares what the city used to be like to what it is like now. In verse 1, it used to be full of people, but it's now deserted. It used to be great among nations, but it's now like a widow. It used to be a queen among the provinces, but it's now a slave. It cries out for relief. Verse 22, see, O Lord, how distressed I am. But, listening to the passage, the author is in no way able to express their trust in God. They're just not in that place to be able to do that. As Philip Yancey wrote one of his excellent books, Where is God When It Hurts? Verse 2 and 3 give us this triple and double whammy of what is going on. Verse 2, her lovers and her friends have all deserted her. There's no one to comfort her. And despite God leading his people into the promised land, they were in exile once again. So we have a really cheery picture of what is going on at the time to this group of people. And yes, it's 2,500 years ago, and yes, it's a long time ago, and yes, it's in a world that a place that we perhaps have visited, perhaps we haven't have visited. But what about us? What about us in those times where we sense that everything is against us? Or perhaps we see people around us in that situation. And the first thing, just a couple of things, is about looking. Verse 18, the Lord is righteous, yet I've rebelled against his command. Listen, all you peoples, and look upon my sufferings. My young men and maidens have gone into exile. Look, please look, says Jerusalem. Look at what is going on within our city. Look upon our sufferings. Sometimes we, or perhaps those around us, bring on our own misfortune. And if you read through, and you'll pick up as we go through, the author is in no way belittling their contribution to the situation that they find themselves in, but equally doesn't make excuses for what they have done wrong. But the cry from Jerusalem, the one who is rampant in grief and suffering, is, look, won't you please just look at me? See what's happened to us. Learn from us. It's that line, those who don't learn the lessons of history are condemned to repeat them. Look on others, but also look on ourselves. 18 months ago, we watched that Sunday evening announcement by the Prime Minister about staying at home. 18 months ago. And I don't know about you, but I think we at home, we sort of have this adrenaline rush, this sort of surge of, right, we're going to do homeschooling. We need to order a printer from Amazon. We need to do all of this stuff to get ready for homeschooling. Little did we know. We might have taken seriously our 1 hour's walk exercise that we could have a day. We had this adrenaline to sort of that pushed us through. We sort of, how are we going to get our shopping? Okay, so let's devise a plan. Let's get a table, and we'll get lots of sticks, and we'll move the ships around as we sort out how we're going to get our food delivered. But I don't think we've really had a chance as individuals, as a church, as a nation, probably as a world, to grieve for what we have lost, because in true human form, we sort of get on with it. And we perhaps think back to people that we have lost, opportunities that have been missed, perhaps confidence that has been knocked. We've carried on, but perhaps not had the chance to look back, to reflect and grieve. Grandparents who meet grandchildren again after a period of time, so haven't they grown? There's something about looking, and there's something about looking at ourselves, but also being able to look on people also who are in that situation. Very tempting to cross the road, isn't it? The other word that appears here quite a lot is the word comfort. It appears a number of times. There's no one to comfort her. There's no one to comfort me. There's no one near to comfort me. I know many of us have been with people in that moment of grief, the death of a loved one, death of a friendship, community, the loss of certainty, the sense of feeling lost, sense of questioning your judgment. We don't quite know what to say, and perhaps all we can do is hold their hand. But I suppose for me, the reason that I want to spend a bit of time on Lamentations over the next few weeks, and there are summer Sundays and weeks to turn up, and you can do Joshua and do others if you really want to. It's this thing about rushing. Because I think the message about Lamentations is not about being afraid to delay reaching the happy ever after. Now, as I said earlier on, absolutely, God is in control. Absolutely, God will bring all things together under one head. Sometimes we get really engrossed into a book, don't we? And there's a bit of us that just wants to jump to the last page to see what happens. Apart from Nikki, of course, every word is beautifully crafted, and there might even be a typo there, which can irritate her. Now, we have a book, of course, where we know what happens in the end, and it's good news. But that doesn't mean that we have to rush people to that point. I've really missed over the last couple of years the walk of witness. Now, for those of you that are new to Tring or perhaps visiting, on Good Friday every year, people from the local churches would gather up at St. Martha's, and we would have a quick service on Good Friday morning, and then we would process behind a large wooden cross all the way down the high street into Dolphin Square, just outside Marks and Spencer's, and then into the churchyard of St. Peter and St. Paul's, and have a quick service, and then go into St. Peter and St. Paul's for hot cross bun or 2 or 3 if you're my children. And that's a really great time because people gather together and they commemorate Good Friday. I always find, and I reflect on this, every year it's sort of the same. You finish scoffing your hot cross bun, and then you go home, and there's this moment, this sort of lull over 36 or so hours. Because you know Easter Sunday is coming. You know we're going to be up at Pitstone Hill, chucking eggs down the hill and scoffing chocolates and dancing with chickens and hens and whatever else it is we do on Easter Sunday. We know it's coming. But there's this sort of 36-hour period in the middle where we're sort of waiting, holding, not really doing. What are we supposed to do? What are we supposed to do? And if you go back to the story of the crucifixion, you had the moment where Jesus was strung onto the cross. You had the moment where he looked down to John, his disciples, and said, "Take care of my mother." You had that moment where he said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" That moment where he said, "It is finished." That moment where the Roman soldier came in and pierced the side of his body, and the blood had separated, indicating that Jesus had in fact died. At that time where Jesus' body was taken down from the cross, and because they needed to get this ready for the Sabbath, because they couldn't do anything on the Sabbath, on the day of rest, they took Jesus' body down and they put him in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. You'll be familiar, I'm sure, with that. What about those around? The tombstone was rolled across. We know it was sealed. And then what? And then what? We would have had the disciples who would have gone home and said, "Well, what have we just been doing for the last 3 years?" You would have had a mother who was grieving for her son. You would have had that moment where, well, what's going on? That moment of sadness and of tragedy and of pain and of hurt, and that moment where I don't think any of them at the time would have said, "But yeah, we've got a book, it'll be all right in the end." I don't think they would have done. I think they would have been in that moment of just unconsolable grief. And I think the reason I want to do Lamentations is I think it's really easy for us as Christians, for those of us that would associate ourselves with that, it's really easy for us to say, it'll be all right in the end, let's rush through to Easter Sunday. Because that's when we get the chocolate, that's when we do the egg bowling, that's when Jesus comes back to earth, that's where we have comes back to life again. That's where we have the resurrection, that's where we have the message that everything will be all right in the end. But sometimes, we need to sit in this holding bay, which is Holy Saturday. That time when nobody really has a clue what's going on, where nobody can see a way out, where nobody really wants to be there, but they don't. You check in, but you never leave. Hotel California, that sort of idea. It's that time in your life where your pig ends up on its snout. Hopefully, for most of us, rare occasions, but times that will happen and will occur. And so that's why I think it's really good for us to look through Lamentations. As I say, we're going to do Summer Sundays for the next few weeks. You can run out there, I don't mind. But Eugene Peterson said, the story in which God does his saving work arises among a people whose primary experience of God is through his absence. The story in which God does his saving work arises among a people whose primary experience of God is through his absence. So what does that mean for us? So instead of rushing through to the it'll be all right in the end position, let's try and deliberately place ourselves in that moment which is Holy Saturday, that time between Good Friday and Easter Saturday. Uncertain, lost, grieving, a perverse holding bay that perhaps goes against everything that we are and that we believe in. But I think somehow we need to hang on to for a while.